It's not every day you wake up to the sound of chains clanking against your Jeep, especially when you know damn well it's parked legally in your own driveway. The sun wasn't even fully up, yet there they were, two guys in reflective vests crouched low, trying to hook my Wrangler to the tow truck like they were burglars sneaking into Fort Knox. I didn't yell. I didn't rush. I just leaned against the doorway, sipping my coffee, watching the spectacle unfold. The leader of the operation wasn't the driver. No, it was Mrs. Douglas, the HOA president, queen of the cul-de-sac. Perfectly ironed blouse, clipboard in hand, lips pursed like she was auditioning for the role of neighborhood dictator. She stood behind the truck, pointing at my Jeep as if she was about to personally claim it as a war prize. "Excuse me," I finally said, calm as ice. "Is there a reason you're stealing my car at sunrise?" Mrs. Douglas didn't even flinch. "Your vehicle violates HOA regulations. Oversized, non-conforming, and creating visual disharmony." She said the last two words with relish, like they were scripture. The tow guys looked embarrassed. One actually muttered, "Are you sure, ma'am? This thing's on private property." "Private property?" she scoffed. "The HOA supersedes your driveway. Read the bylaws." I had read the bylaws. Twice. I knew my Jeep didn't violate a single line. But Mrs. Douglas thrived on intimidation. If she could rattle me into shouting, she'd win. So I smiled. "Go ahead then. Hook it up. But I'd check your insurance policy first." The driver glanced at me, then at her. She was glaring daggers, and he clearly didn't want to be stuck in the middle. He started to lower the hook toward my bumper. That's when fate, karma, or maybe just the universe's sense of humor intervened. The chain slipped from his grip, whipped sideways, and latched itself perfectly onto the shiny grille of the black BMW idling in the next driveway. Mrs. Douglas's BMW. Her pride and joy, waxed to mirror perfection every Saturday morning. The tow operator yanked on the lever before realizing what had happened, and the whole truck lurched forward, dragging the Beamer a good 2 feet across the concrete with a gut-wrenching metallic screech. I nearly spit out my coffee. Mrs. Douglas shrieked like someone had shot her. She sprinted forward, smacking the tow truck's door with her clipboard. "Stop! Stop! That's my car!" The driver scrambled to reverse, panic on his face. The hook clanged free, leaving behind a jagged scratch across her grille that caught the early light like a scar of divine justice. For a moment, silence reigned. Even the birds seemed to pause. I set my mug down on the porch railing. "You were saying something about visual disharmony?" Her face turned crimson. She spun on me, voice trembling with outrage. "This is your fault." I raised an eyebrow. "My fault your hook latched onto your own car? You might want to check those bylaws again. I don't recall a section about bad karma being transferable." She opened her mouth, closed it, then pointed a shaking finger at me. "This isn't over." Of course it wasn't over. With Mrs. Douglas, nothing ever was. By noon, half the neighborhood had already heard the story. I didn't spread it myself. I didn't need to. People talk, and in a community this tightly wound, scandal spreads faster than fertilizer on a front lawn. By evening, a couple of neighbors had stopped by to casually ask what happened. I recounted the story as matter-of-factly as possible, never embellishing, just letting the absurdity speak for itself. Mrs. Douglas, however, wasn't content to lick her wounds. She immediately filed a formal violation notice against me for vehicular noncompliance and neighborhood disruption. She stapled the letter right to my door like it was a scarlet letter. I kept it. I like souvenirs. But here's the thing, her BMW's scratch wasn't just cosmetic. A neighbor later told me she took it to the shop, and they quoted her thousands for front-end repair. Suddenly her little act of HOA theater had become an expensive lesson. Except, of course, people like her don't learn lessons. They plot revenge. The next morning, I found a group of board members gathered near my driveway with tape measures, snapping photos of my Jeep from different angles like it was a crime scene. Mrs. Douglas stood in the middle, giving orders, her clipboard newly covered with color-coded tabs. I leaned against the hood of my car, arms crossed. "Good morning, paparazzi. Do I need to sign a release form?" She didn't respond directly, just hissed to the others, "Document everything. We'll prove it violates clearance standards." Clearance standards? That wasn't even in the bylaws. But I realized then, this wasn't about the Jeep. This was about humiliation. Her precious BMW had been dragged across the pavement in front of witnesses. She couldn't let it stand. So she'd bend, twist, and outright invent rules until she could declare victory. I wasn't worried. People like her always underestimate patience. She thought I'd fight fire with fire, rage with rage. But I prefer rope. Rope is quiet. Rope waits. And rope only tightens when someone pulls too hard. That evening, I drafted a letter of my own. Not to the HOA board. To every homeowner in the subdivision. A calm, sarcastic little note about yesterday's unfortunate mishap, where the tow company hired by our board had accidentally damaged the president's personal vehicle while attempting to enforce a non-existent rule. I didn't accuse. I didn't insult. I simply laid out the facts in crisp, dry sentences and attached a copy of the actual bylaw concerning vehicle size. I slipped a copy into each mailbox like I was handing out invitations to a party. The next morning, when Mrs. Douglas strutted outside expecting her story to dominate, she found whispers already circling. Whispers she couldn't control. The look on her face when she realized she wasn't the narrator of this drama anymore, that was priceless. But even as I enjoyed my small victory, I knew it was just the opening move. She wouldn't stop at embarrassment. No, Mrs. Douglas was the type who'd burn down her own reputation just to make sure you went down with her. And if her scratch was a spark, the real fire was only beginning. That was the morning I decided to play the long game. Because while she obsessed over bylaws and tape measures, I had something she didn't. Time, patience, and the ability to stay calm while her own rope slowly tightened around her neck. And the first tug was already in motion. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening, and I knew Mrs. Douglas would treat it like her personal courtroom. She never missed an opportunity to grandstand in front of the board. I went not because I had to, but because watching her spin her web was like attending a free theater performance. The folding chairs in the clubhouse were lined up neatly, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and a stack of agendas sat on the table. Every item except one was about routine maintenance, potholes, pool hours, lawn service contracts. The last line read, "Vehicle Compliance Review." That was me. When I walked in, heads turned. Some neighbors gave me sympathetic smiles, others avoided eye contact, not wanting to pick side. Mrs. Douglas sat at the head of the table, posture straight, blouse crisp, her repaired BMW key fob displayed prominently in front of her like a badge of authority. The other board members shuffled papers, clearly nervous. She began the meeting with her usual pomp. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending. Tonight we must address a matter of great concern to our community's visual integrity and safety. The issue of non-conforming vehicles parked prominently in driveways." She looked right at me. I raised my hand. "Is this about my Jeep, or are we worried about the 15-year-old minivan parked 2 doors down that's held together with duct tape and hope?" Murmurs rippled through the room. Mrs. Douglas tightened her jaw. "This is not about singling anyone out. This is about community standards." "Then why is my license plate number listed under evidence on the agenda?" I asked. She ignored me and launched into her slideshow. Yes, she had a slideshow. On the projector flashed photos of my Jeep at every conceivable angle, front, back, side, even a shot from the upstairs window of her house that must have required a zoom lens. She'd labeled each image with red arrows pointing to infractions: the oversized tires, the lifted suspension, the winch attached to the bumper. One of the board members, a soft-spoken guy named Leonard, cleared his throat. I don't recall any rule about tire size or winches." Mrs. Douglas snapped. "It falls under visual disharmony. Page 14, subsection C. I flipped open my own binder, because, unlike most of the residents, I actually kept a copy of the bylaws. Page 14, subsection C refers to external decorative additions inconsistent with neighborhood aesthetics. It's about flamingo statues and neon paint jobs. Unless my Jeep is secretly pink with feathers, I don't think that applies. A few chuckles escaped from the audience. Mrs. Douglas glared, her cheeks turning blotchy. The spirit of the rule applies. This neighborhood strives for uniformity. That vehicle is disruptive. I leaned back in my chair, calm as ever. You mean it disrupts the view of your BMW? Her face froze. A direct hit. The room shifted after that. People weren't openly on my side, but they weren't on hers either. They'd seen her car get dragged across the driveway. They knew this crusade was personal. But Mrs. Douglas wasn't the type to retreat gracefully. She doubled down. I propose, she said firmly, that we enact an amendment requiring all vehicles over a certain height or with visible aftermarket modifications to be parked out of sight, in garages only. It was a power move. If the amendment passed, my Jeep would technically be in violation, and she'd have the legal cover she desperately wanted. But amendments required votes, and votes required persuasion. So I stayed quiet and let her talk. She ranted about property values, about safety hazards, about how children might be intimidated by the aggressive appearance of my Jeep. The more she spoke, the more ridiculous it sounded. By the time she suggested that my winch posed a psychological threat, even Leonard was rubbing his temples. When the motion finally went to a vote, she raised her hand immediately, expecting the others to follow. Only 2 did. 3 abstained. And Leonard, bless his tired soul, voted against. The motion fails, the secretary announced. Mrs. Douglas looked like she'd swallowed a lemon. After the meeting adjourned, I lingered in the parking lot. A couple of neighbors came up quietly. One of them, an older guy named Carl, muttered, "Don't let her get to you. She's been pulling this for years." Another whispered, "That was the best show I've seen in this clubhouse." I just smiled and said, "She's tightening her own rope. Just give it time." But Mrs. Douglas wasn't done. The very next morning, I found a bright orange notice taped to my garage door. Final warning, non-compliance. She'd skipped the intermediate steps, going straight for the jugular. It was laughable. The notice cited her failed amendment as if it had already passed. She was rewriting reality, and she expected me to play along. I didn't. Instead, I documented everything. Photos of the notice, copies of the bylaws, a time-stamped video of me reading the document aloud for clarity. I uploaded it all to a folder labeled HOA Nonsense, because I had a feeling this saga wasn't ending anytime soon. That evening, while I was grilling on the back patio, my neighbor Julia leaned over the fence. She'd lived here longer than anyone and had clashed with Mrs. Douglas before. "She's going to push until you snap," Julia warned. "That's her playbook. She makes you angry, you make a mistake, and then she has you." "I don't snap," I said, flipping a burger. "I watch." Julia smirked. "Good. Then you'll enjoy this." She hired the tow company again. I overheard her on the phone. "They're coming back this weekend." I laughed out loud. She really wants a sequel to the BMW incident? But it wasn't funny. A repeat attempt meant escalation. She wanted to humiliate me publicly, maybe even get the Jeep removed before I could stop it. If she pulled it off, she'd rewrite the narrative, make me the one scrambling for damage control. So I made preparations. I checked my driveway security cameras, made sure they were angled properly. I moved my Jeep a few feet forward so it lined up directly beside the BMW parked next door. It was petty, sure, but I wanted the tow operator to have déjà vu. And then I waited. The weekend arrived, and with it, the rumble of a familiar tow truck. Early morning again, just after sunrise, like they thought I'd be asleep. I was awake, coffee in hand, standing by the window with my phone recording. The driver looked hesitant, clearly remembering last time. Mrs. Douglas, however, was in full general mode, barking orders and pointing at my Jeep. "Do it quickly before he comes out," she snapped. I stepped outside casually, mug in hand. "Morning. You boys must have short memories." The driver froze, the hook dangling midair. Mrs. Douglas stormed toward me. "This is official enforcement. You're obstructing HOA authority." I pointed to the cameras mounted above the garage. "And you're trespassing on private property. Every second is being recorded." The driver's hands trembled. He glanced between me, the Jeep, and Mrs. Douglas's BMW gleaming right beside it. His hesitation stretched longer and longer. Finally, with a sigh, he muttered, "I'm not doing this again, lady," and climbed back into the truck. Mrs. Douglas nearly combusted. "You can't leave. You're contracted." He drove off anyway, leaving her standing in the middle of the street, screaming into the empty air. I took a slow sip of coffee. Guess visual disharmony's contagious. She spun, clipboard raised like a weapon, but she didn't speak. Not this time. She just stormed back into her house, slamming the door so hard the window panes rattled. I knew then that the game had changed. She'd burned her bridge with the tow company, embarrassed herself in front of witnesses again, and wasted the HOA's money on a failed enforcement. She wasn't just fighting me anymore, she was fighting her own crumbling authority. And people like her, when cornered, don't retreat. They lash out. That was when I realized I hadn't seen the worst of Mrs. Douglas yet. Not even close. By Monday morning, Mrs. Douglas had transformed from HOA president to full-scale propagandist. She didn't just lick her wounds after the tow fiasco. She went on the offensive with the kind of fury you usually see in political campaigns. Every mailbox in the neighborhood had a freshly printed newsletter. 8 glossy pages stapled together, complete with stock photos of community-friendly neighborhoods and fake quotes from anonymous, concerned residents. Front and center on page 1 was a picture of my Jeep, blown up to tabloid size with the headline, "Is this vehicle lowering our property values?" The article beneath it was dripping with venom disguised as concern. It claimed oversized vehicles attracted unsavory visitors, suggested winches and tow hooks were symbols of aggressive culture, and hinted that homes next to non-conforming vehicles could lose up to 10% of their resale value. I nearly choked on my breakfast cereal reading it. Julia, my neighbor across the fence, walked over waving her copy. "She's lost her mind," Julia said flatly. "Oh, this is fantastic," I replied, grinning. She just published libel in mass circulation. On her own HOA letterhead. Julia smirked. "You're enjoying this way too much." She wasn't wrong. Most people would be stressed, maybe even intimidated. But the more Douglas flailed, the more rope she fed me. I didn't have to fight her. All I had to do was document her theatrics and wait for the natural collapse. Still, I couldn't resist giving her a little push. That evening, I drafted my own letter. Not glossy, not flashy, just one page typed up on plain white paper. I titled it, "A Few Corrections for Clarity." I pointed out, with direct quotes from the bylaws, that there was no rule against aftermarket vehicles or winches. I attached a screenshot from a real estate website showing that the average home in our subdivision had appreciated more in the past 3 years than the county average. I even included a sarcastic little line at the end. If my Jeep truly holds that much power over the economy, perhaps the Federal Reserve should hire it. I slipped a copy under every door after dark, just like she had. The next morning, I went for a jog and noticed neighbors clustered on driveways, copies of both letters in hand, arguing in hushed tones. A couple gave me nods of approval. One guy actually clapped when I jogged past. Mrs. Douglas, however, stormed down the street like a general inspecting troops, barking at anyone who dared hold my letter. By the time the week was out, it wasn't just my Jeep under scrutiny, it was her leadership. People began quietly asking each other why HOA dues were being wasted on failed tow attempts, newsletters, and petty crusades. Leonard, the board member who had voted against her, cornered me in the grocery store one afternoon. "She's losing the board," he said in a low voice. "Half of us are sick of being dragged into this circus." "Then stop enabling her," I replied. "It's that simple." He nodded but looked conflicted. "She's persuasive. People are afraid of being her next target." That was the heart of it. 4 years, she'd ruled by intimidation, turning her clipboard into a weapon. But the BMW incident had cracked her image, and every desperate move since then widened the fissure. It all came to a head on Saturday. I was in my garage tinkering with the Jeep, changing out a set of auxiliary lights, when I heard raised voices outside. Stepping out, I saw Mrs. Douglas marching up the street, flanked by 2 board members like bodyguard. In her hand was a fat manila envelope, and she was shouting for everyone's attention. "Residents of Maplewood Estates," she bellowed, standing right in the middle of the cul-de-sac. "We cannot allow lawlessness to reign in our neighborhood. This man," she pointed directly at me, "has repeatedly defied HOA authority, endangered our community's harmony, and spread lies about your elected leadership." I set my wrench down slowly, wiping my hands on a rag. "Morning, Mrs. Douglas. You might want to watch your volume. People will think you've lost control." Her face darkened. She opened the envelope and began handing out copies of a document. Curious neighbors gathered, taking them reluctantly. I snagged one myself. At the top it read, "Notice of intent to fine." She'd written up a formal motion to fine me $500 a week until my Jeep was brought into compliance. Gasps went around the crowd. One guy muttered, "That's not even legal." I flipped through the pages, noting her usual creative citations and misinterpretations of the bylaws. Calmly, I raised my voice just enough for the group to hear. "Interesting. According to Section 8, fines can only be levied after a hearing with impartial board members. Did that happen while I was asleep?" Leonard, standing awkwardly in the back, spoke up. "No hearing has been scheduled. This motion hasn't even been voted on." Mrs. Douglas turned on him like a hawk. "Leonard, stay out of this." But the damage was done. Neighbors were looking at her differently now, not as a strict but competent leader, but as a petty tyrant making up rules on the fly. I could see it in their faces. The tide was shifting. "Tell you what," I said, folding the papers neatly. "If you really want to fine me, go ahead. But just so you know, every word of this document has already been uploaded to a lawyer's inbox. Along with the video of your toe stunt. Along with your newsletter." That wasn't entirely true. I hadn't sent anything to a lawyer yet. But the way her eyes widened told me she believed it. And that was enough. For once, she didn't have a comeback. She just stood there, gripping her clipboard so tightly her knuckles whitened. Then she spun on her heel and stormed back to her BMW, her entourage scrambling to keep up. The cul-de-sac was silent for a long moment, then someone snickered. Another laughed. Soon the whole group was chuckling, not at me, but at her. That was the moment her grip broke. Over the next week, the whispers turned into open conversations. Julia told me she overheard neighbors at the pool talking about removing her as president. Carl mentioned a petition was quietly circulating. Even Leonard dropped by one evening, hands stuffed in his pockets, and said, "If you push now, you could have the votes to oust her." But I wasn't rushing. No, that wasn't my style. People who move too fast tip their hand. Mrs. Douglas was unraveling all on her own. I didn't need to cut the rope when she was already sawing through it. Instead, I went about my days as usual, Jeep parked proudly in the driveway, waving at neighbors who were increasingly warm toward me. I even mowed my lawn twice that week, just to make sure no one could accuse me of slacking on actual HOA responsibilities. Meanwhile, Mrs. Douglas doubled down. She began patrolling the neighborhood at odd hours, flashlight in hand, jotting down violations in her notebook. Trash cans left out too long, porch lights with bulbs too bright, flower beds with improper mulch. But every time she slapped a warning on someone's door, they remembered her BMW screeching across the pavement. They remembered her screaming in the street. And they stopped being afraid. The real turning point came when she tried to fine Carl for having an American flag that was too large. Carl, a retired Army colonel, nearly blew a gasket. Within 24 hours, the petition to remove her had doubled in signatures. I watched it all unfold with a kind of detached amusement. I didn't have to stir the pot, she was boiling it herself. Still, I knew this wasn't the end. People like Mrs. Douglas don't go down quietly. She wasn't going to hand over power gracefully. No, she'd pull every lever, call in every favor, throw every tantrum before she let go. And sure enough, the night before the next board meeting, I caught sight of her in her driveway, phone pressed to her ear, pacing like a general before battle. Her BMW gleamed under the streetlight, freshly polished as if she needed armor. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but I could read her body language. Desperate, frantic, plotting. Something big was coming. And from the way she gestured at my Jeep across the street, I knew I was the center of it. The first 2 battles had gone to me. But Mrs. Douglas was gearing up for war. The night of the board meeting felt different. People weren't just trickling into the clubhouse out of obligation, they were showing up like it was a sporting event. The parking lot overflowed, kids chased each other on the lawn, and clusters of neighbors gathered in little knots, murmuring about what they expected to happen. I arrived a few minutes early, Jeep gleaming under the streetlight, and walked in with the calm stride of someone carrying a full hand of cards. Mrs. Douglas was already there, sitting ramrod straight at the head of the table. Her BMW key fob, once a symbol of pride, now looked like a nervous tick in her hand as she clicked it over and over. Behind her sat a stack of binders thicker than phone books, filled, no doubt, with evidence against me and half the neighborhood. She wore a smug smile that was almost too wide, like someone trying to convince themselves they'd already won. The room buzzed with chatter until she banged her gavel. "Order! Order!" she barked, enjoying the sound of authority echoing off the cinderblock walls. "We have important business tonight, and we will conduct it with decorum." She launched into the agenda, but it was obvious she was rushing through the early items. Pool maintenance, landscaping contracts, streetlight repairs, all zipped past with barely a pause. She wanted to get to the fireworks. When she finally reached disciplinary actions, she straightened, tapped her clipboard, and said, "The board will now hear evidence regarding Mr. Johnson's ongoing violations." That was my cue. I raised my hand. Point of order. Isn't disciplinary action supposed to begin with a formal hearing, not a public ambush? A murmur spread across the room. She waved her hand dismissively. "This is the hearing." I smiled thinly. "Then I'd like it noted for the record that this process violates Section 10, Article B of the Bylaws, which requires impartial adjudication. Unless you're suggesting you're impartial." More murmurs. Leonard, seated near the secretary, shifted uncomfortably. "He's correct," he muttered. Mrs. Douglas ignored him, and snapped open her binder. "Neighbors, this is not about technicalities. This is about community integrity. I present Exhibit A." On the projector flashed another photo of my Jeep, this one clearly taken that very morning. She zoomed in on the tires, then the winch, then the aftermarket lights. Each time she clicked, she rattled off some invented violation. "Oversized, threatening, disruptive," she declared. I raised my hand again. "Are you describing a car or a supervillain?" The crowd laughed. The sound seemed to physically wound her. She slammed the binder shut and hissed, "Enough of your mockery?" But the laughter had shifted the atmosphere. Neighbors weren't cowed anymore, they were entertained. She realized she was losing control, so she pulled out her trump card. "Exhibit B," she said, holding up a sheaf of papers. "An independent towing contractor's report, stating this vehicle poses a safety hazard to the community." Gasps circled the room. She laid the papers on the table dramatically. I leaned forward to glance at them, and nearly burst out laughing. The report was a one-page document on generic letterhead, riddled with typos, signed by no one, with the vague statement, Large off-road vehicle unsafe in residential setting. I raised my voice. Did you pay someone on $5 to type this? The audience erupted in chuckles again. Julia, sitting in the back, actually clapped once. Leonard pinched the bridge of his nose. This is valid evidence. Mrs. Douglas screeched, her voice cracking. It's a Word doc with clip art, I said calmly. If this is the best you've got, I'd hate to see Exhibit C. She slammed her gavel again and shrieked, Exhibit C is your arrogance, Mr. Johnson. The room roared with laughter this time. And that was the moment she lost the crowd. They weren't afraid of her anymore. They were openly mocking her. Even the board members looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. I stayed quiet, letting the silence stretch until the laughter died down. Then I said evenly, I think we've all seen enough. The bylaws are clear. My Jeep is compliant. What's not compliant is this abuse of process. And if the board doesn't end this farce tonight, I'll have no choice but to escalate outside the HOA. The word escalate hung in the air like a thundercloud. Everyone knew what it meant. Lawyers, lawsuits, public embarrassment. The one thing HOA boards fear most. Leonard cleared his throat. I move that we dismiss this complaint and return to regular business. Seconded, another board member muttered. Mrs. Douglas slammed her gavel so hard I thought it might splinter. You can't dismiss this. This is vital to our community. The secretary, looking pale, said softly, motion carried. Complaint dismissed. And just like that it was over. Except it wasn't. Mrs. Douglas didn't stand, didn't leave, didn't concede. She sat frozen, gripping her gavel, eyes wild, as if she couldn't process what had just happened. Around her, the room dissolved into chatter, neighbors shaking hands with me, patting me on the back, openly mocking her theatrics. But I knew her well enough by now. She wasn't beaten. She was plotting. Sure enough, the very next morning, I woke to find my Jeep covered in bright yellow stickers plastered across the windshield, hood, and doors. Each one screamed violation in bold letters. They weren't official HOA notices. Just cheap printouts, probably from her home printer, but they were sticky as hell and took me 20 minutes to scrape off. As I peeled the last one from my rearview mirror, Julia walked over holding her coffee. She did it in the middle of the night, she said. I saw her skulking around with a roll of tape like some kind of deranged raccoon. I sighed. She's unraveling. Julia smirked. Unraveling people make the best mistakes. She was right. And Mrs. Douglas didn't disappoint. That evening, she marched door to door with a petition, not the one to remove her, but her own counter-petition to enforce new, emergency vehicle regulations. She tried to scare people with talk of insurance liabilities and criminal associations. But the more she pushed, the more people rolled their eyes. Carl, the retired colonel, slammed his door in her face. Julia laughed outright. Others just refused to answer. By the time she reached my driveway, red-faced and panting, she shoved the clipboard at me. Sign it, she demanded. I looked at the blank lines. Maybe 5 names total, all her usual loyalists. That's it? I asked. Half this street would sign if it said, Remove Douglas. Her eyes narrowed to slits. You think this is funny? You won't be laughing when the sheriff shows up. That caught my attention. The sheriff? She smirked. Yes. I've filed a complaint with the county. You'll see. For the first time in this whole ordeal, I felt a flicker of genuine unease. Bluffing bylaws and fabricating reports was one thing. But if she really had dragged the county into this, things could get messy. I didn't let it show. I leaned casually against the hood of the Jeep and said, Good. The sheriff can bring a tape measure and settle this once and for all. Just make sure he parks carefully. Wouldn't want him scratching your BMW again. Her smug expression faltered just enough to tell me she wasn't as confident as she pretended. She spun on her heel and stomped away, clipboard shaking in her grip. That night, I sat on my porch with a beer, watching the street, waiting for the supposed cavalry. They didn't come. But I knew she'd made the call. It was only a matter of time before someone in uniform showed up, forced to waste taxpayer money on her vendetta. And when that happened, the real game would begin. Because if there's one thing law enforcement hates more than anything, it's being used as someone's personal HOA hit squad. Mrs. Douglas had just raised the stakes, and I was ready to watch her gamble everything she had left. The sheriff's cruiser rolled into the neighborhood 2 mornings later, just as I was tightening the last lug nut on my Jeep's front wheel. I'd known it was coming, but the timing still made me chuckle. It was almost cinematic, the way the squad car glided down the street while sprinklers hissed across neatly trimmed lawns and kids pedaled past on bike. Of course, Mrs. Douglas had staged the whole scene. She was waiting on her front porch, dressed in what I can only describe as courtroom chic. Navy blazer, pearls, hair shellacked to immobility. She marched forward the second the deputy stepped out, clutching a manila folder like it was a holy text. "Officer! Over here! This is the man!" she shrieked, pointing straight at me as if she'd finally cornered a fugitive. I calmly wiped my hands on a rag and leaned against the Jeep. The deputy, a stocky guy with a sunburned neck and mirrored sunglasses, looked more annoyed than impressed. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "you called about a code violation?" "Yes," she said, nearly vibrating with self-righteous energy. "This man's vehicle is oversized, non-conforming, and in violation of county safety standard. It must be removed at once. I have all the documentation here." She shoved the folder into his hands. He flipped it open, skimmed a page or two, and frowned. "This looks like HOA paperwork." "It's more than that," she snapped. "It's evidence of non-compliance with visual harmony statutes." "Visual harmony statutes?" he repeated, eyebrows lifting above his sunglasses. I couldn't resist. "That's not a real thing, officer. Unless you're planning to ticket people for wearing clashing socks." A ripple of laughter drifted from the growing group of neighbors gathering on their lawns. They'd been waiting for this. The deputy sighed, clearly wishing he'd drawn a different assignment. "Ma'am, county code doesn't regulate what kind of car you can park in your driveway. Unless it's an abandoned vehicle or blocking the road, it's not our business." She gasped as if he'd betrayed her. "You can't just ignore a crime." "There's no crime here," he said flatly. She turned on me, her voice rising to a near scream. "You bribed him, didn't you? That's the only explanation." The deputy straightened, his patience snapping. "Ma'am, I don't take kindly to accusations like that. Do you want me to start writing reports about false calls to law enforcement?" The silence that followed was exquisite. Mrs. Douglas's face blanched. For the first time since this saga began, she looked genuinely rattled. She tried to recover, waving her hands dramatically. "I know that won't be necessary. But you'll regret ignoring this. You'll see." The deputy tucked her folder under his arm, handed it back without ceremony, and tipped his hat toward me. "Sir, you're good to go. Enjoy your day." "Always do," I said, giving him a small salute. As the cruiser pulled away, the neighbors broke into open chuckles. Julia actually whistled and Carl, the retired colonel, muttered loud enough for everyone to hear, "Waste of county resources. Disgraceful." Mrs. Douglas retreated to her porch, clutching her folder like a lifeline, but the damage was done. Her reputation had been shredded publicly, in broad daylight, with half the subdivision as witnesses. Still, I knew better than to relax. Humiliation doesn't end a tyrant, it fuels them. And sure enough, that evening I spotted her pacing her living room through the blinds, phone glued to her ear. She wasn't quitting. She was recalibrating. The next morning, the escalation came in the form of a certified letter. She'd filed a civil complaint in small claims court against me for community damages and reputational harm. The demanded amount, $10,000. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped the envelope into the grill fire. 10 grand? For what? For parking legally in my own driveway? For existing in the line of sight of her BMW? Julia read the letter over my shoulder and whistled. "She's gone nuclear." "Good," I said, tossing the letter onto the table. Because you know what happens when someone files a frivolous claim? Discovery. Discovery. Yep. Lawyers get to dig. And I've got hours of footage of her harassing me, 2 failed tow attempts, and a newsletter full of libel with her name on it. If she wants war, she'll get scorched earth. For the first time, Julia looked almost giddy. I'll bring popcorn. But before the court date even approached, Mrs. Douglas made one more desperate play. A week later, I woke to a commotion outside, flashing lights, sirens, the unmistakable grind of heavy machinery. I rushed to the window and nearly spit out my coffee. She had called in a private towing company again. This time not some rinky-dink operation, but a heavy-duty truck big enough to haul semis. The operator was already lowering an industrial hook toward my Jeep, looking more confused than committed. I stepped outside, phone recording. "Morning," I said casually. "You know you're trespassing, right?" The driver frowned. "Lady said this was HOA property." "Really?" I tilted my camera toward my clearly marked driveway, my mailbox with my house number, the deed-framed sign I'd hung on the garage for just such an occasion. "Does this look like HOA property to you?" He hesitated, scratching his neck. "Look, she paid us in advance. Said this was official business." "Official business?" I asked, zooming in on Mrs. Douglas, who stood at the curb like a victorious general. "Because it sure looks like fraud." Neighbors poured out of their houses, phones raised, documenting every second. Carl shouted, "That's private property. You'll be sued into bankruptcy if you touch that Jeep." The driver's face drained of color. He muttered something under his breath, yanked the hook back up, and climbed into the cab. The massive truck rumbled, turned, and drove away, leaving Mrs. Douglas screaming at the exhaust fumes. "Cowards!" she shrieked. "You're all cowards!" I stepped closer, my phone still recording. "You just paid thousands for a tow truck that didn't even touch my car. Congratulations, you've officially achieved the Guinness World Record for most expensive temper tantrum." The crowd erupted in laughter. Even her loyalists, the 2 or 3 neighbors who usually stood at her side, had quietly slipped away. She was alone, her clipboard dangling uselessly at her side, her BMW gleaming mockingly behind her. That night, as I uploaded the footage online, privately to a folder I was preparing in case court became necessary, I realized the scales had tipped. She wasn't just losing control, she was unraveling completely. The sheriff had rebuked her. The neighbors were laughing at her. Her reputation was in tatters. And yet, instead of retreating, she was digging deeper, clawing desperately to keep her grip on power. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. The following week, word spread quickly. Several board members had resigned. They were done being dragged into her vendettas. A petition to remove her formally had gained more than enough signatures to trigger a recall vote. The meeting was scheduled for Friday night. Julia stopped by my porch that evening with a bottle of wine. "You realize you've become the neighborhood folk hero, right?" "Folk hero?" I chuckled. "All I did was park my Jeep." She raised her glass. "And expose a tyrant." But I wasn't celebrating yet. Because I knew Mrs. Douglas. She wouldn't accept a recall. She wouldn't bow out gracefully. No, she'd fight until the very end, even if it meant dragging the whole neighborhood down with her. Sure enough, on the night of the recall meeting, she walked into the clubhouse like a queen making her last stand. Dressed in another immaculate suit, chin lifted defiantly, she carried a thick stack of papers she declared to be her final evidence. "Tonight," she announced to the packed room, "you will see the truth. This man has not only violated our rules, he has undermined the very foundation of our community. And I will prove it once and for all." I sat in the front row, calm, quiet, ready. Because I knew something she didn't. In her desperation, she was about to hand me the single greatest weapon I could ever hope for, her own overreach. And when that moment came, the rope she'd been tightening around me for weeks would snap back around her neck, and pull tighter than ever. The clubhouse was standing room only that Friday night. Neighbors packed the folding chairs, lined the walls, even peered through the glass windows from outside. You could feel the tension in the air like static before a thunderstorm. Everyone knew this was the endgame. Either Mrs. Douglas held onto her crown, or the neighborhood finally toppled her. I sat in the front row, arms crossed, calm as ever. My Jeep was parked right outside the clubhouse doors, gleaming under the security lights like a symbol of defiance. Julia sat 2 seats over, smirking like she'd paid for premium seats at a Broadway show. Carl leaned against the back wall with his arms folded across his chest, a silent sentinel daring anyone to try nonsense. Mrs. Douglas marched in like she was leading a parade. She wore a new blazer, navy again, her pearls polished, her hair shellacked to perfection. She clutched a fat binder under one arm and a stack of stapled packets under the other. Her heels clicked sharply against the tile as she strode to the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice quivering with a blend of fury and self-importance, "tonight we face a decision that will determine the future of Maplewood Estates. Do we allow one man to mock our rules, destroy our harmony, and reduce our property values? Or do we stand together as a community?" A murmur spread, half groans, half snickers. She slammed the binder on the podium, making the microphone squeal. "I present to you, once and for all, the evidence of Mr. Johnson's repeated violations." She began handing out her stapled packets row by row, like a teacher distributing pop quizzes. I flipped through mine, scanning quickly. It was an unhinged masterpiece. Blurry photos of my Jeep from every conceivable angle, half of them circled in red like crime scene exhibits. Made-up statistics about home prices plummeting near military-style vehicles, even a chart claiming my winch could attract criminal elements. Julia leaned over. "She actually cited Wikipedia for one of these footnotes," she whispered, pointing at the bottom of a page. I almost laughed out loud. But the piece de resistance came when she flipped the projector on. Up flashed a slide titled Community Testimonies. Beneath it were quotes supposedly from neighbors. "His Jeep makes me feel unsafe. My children cry when they see it. We fear gang activity." The room erupted in gasps and laughter. Someone from the back yelled, "Nobody said that." Another voice chimed in, "That's not even my handwriting." Mrs. Douglas tried to raise her voice over the commotion. "These testimonies were gathered during my patrols." Carl barked a laugh. "Patrols? You mean when you were snooping around people's houses with a flashlight at midnight?" Her face turned blotchy red. She raised her hands, trembling with rage. "Order! I demand order!" But there was no order. The crowd had turned. They weren't afraid of her anymore. They were mocking her, openly, loudly. Every word she spoke now only fanned the flames. I finally stood, calm, steady. "May I?" I asked, nodding toward the microphone. She clutched the podium like a life raft. "You may not." But Leonard, seated beside her with an exhausted look, pushed the mic toward me. "Go ahead." I stepped up, holding her packet in one hand. "Neighbors, I've been accused of many things tonight. Of lowering your property values. Of attracting gangs. Of making children cry. But let's set aside the theatrics and look at the facts." I flipped to the bylaws page I'd highlighted earlier. "Our rules are clear. Vehicles must be operational, legally registered, and not abandoned. That's it. My Jeep is compliant on all counts." I held up her packet. "What we've seen tonight is not evidence. It's desperation. Blurry photos, fake quotes, Wikipedia citations. This isn't about rules. It's about one person's bruised pride." The crowd murmured in agreement. Someone clapped. I pressed on, voice calm but firm. "This isn't just about me. Look around. How many of you have gotten warning notices for flower beds, porch lights, trash cans, even flags on your porches? How many of you have felt bullied, singled out, or threatened with fines?" Hands shot up all around the room. Julia raised both hers. Carl shouted, "Amen." "This isn't an HOA," I continued. It's one woman's personal kingdom. And tonight, you have the chance to decide whether you want to keep living under that rule. I stepped back, letting the words hang. The room was electric, buzzing with anger and laughter and relief all at once. For the first time, people saw clearly what had been obvious for months. This was no longer about a Jeep. It was about control. Mrs. Douglas, cornered, tried one last swing. She raised her binder high above her head and slammed it down on the podium. Papers flew everywhere. "You'll regret this," she shrieked. "Without me, this neighborhood will fall into chaos. Do you want uncut lawns? Do you want broken mailboxes? Do you want—" Her rant was cut short by the sound of the secretary's voice, firm and unwavering. "It's time for the vote." Silence fell. The ballots were handed out quickly, quietly. People ticked boxes with pens, dropped slips into a cardboard box at the front. Mrs. Douglas sat stiffly, glaring daggers at every hand that moved. I sat back in my chair, calm, hands folded in my lap. When the counting began, the tension was palpable. One by one, slips were read aloud. Remove. 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 The pattern was unmistakable. By the halfway point, it was clear. By the end, it was overwhelming. By a vote of 37-6, the secretary announced, "Mrs. Douglas is removed as president of the HOA." The room erupted. Cheers, claps, even a few whistles. Julia hugged me. Carl pumped his fist in the air. Neighbors who'd never even spoken to me before slapped my back. But Mrs. Douglas? She didn't move. She sat frozen, face pale, lips trembling. Then, slowly, she rose, gathering her scattered papers, clutching her binder to her chest. Without a word, she stormed out of the clubhouse, heels clicking like gunshots. The door slammed behind her. The celebration went on, but I stayed quiet, thoughtful. I'd won, sure. The Jeep was safe, the bylaws upheld, the tyrant dethroned. But I knew Mrs. Douglas well enough to know this wasn't the end. People like her don't fade quietly into the background. They plot. They fester. They wait. Sure enough, as I walked home that night, I saw her BMW idling in her driveway, headlights off, her silhouette visible through the windshield. She was sitting there, unmoving, watching. Julia caught up to me and whispered, "That woman's not done. You know that, right?" "I know," I said softly. "But neither am I." And in that moment, I realized something important. This wasn't just a neighborhood squabble anymore. It was a full-blown war. The first act had ended, but the sequel, the really messy one, was just beginning. Because when people like Mrs. Douglas lose power, they don't go quietly. They come back harder, crazier, and more desperate than ever. And I had no doubt she was already plotting her next move. The question wasn't if she'd strike back. It was when. And how. For a few blissful days, the neighborhood felt lighter. Lawns looked greener, the pool seemed busier, and kids laughed louder as they zipped down the street on scooters. Without Mrs. Douglas breathing down everyone's necks, people relaxed, almost like someone had lifted an invisible weight off their shoulders. Neighbors waved more. Julia even hosted a barbecue, something she'd avoided for years because she knew Douglas would show up with a clipboard to measure the grill smoke against air quality standards. But peace never lasts long when someone like Mrs. Douglas is licking her wounds. On the fourth night after her removal, I woke to a metallic clank outside my window. I peeked through the blinds and saw a shadow hunched near my Jeep. The figure froze, then darted away into the dark. I slipped outside with my flashlight and found it immediately. A long, deep scratch carved across the passenger door, running the full length like a deliberate wound. It wasn't the work of kids. It was too precise, too purposeful. She'd struck back. The next morning, I didn't rage. I didn't storm to her door. I simply documented it. Photos. Time-stamped video. A report filed with the sheriff's office. Calm, methodical, airtight. If she thought she could bait me into a meltdown, she'd underestimated me again. By mid-morning, the neighborhood was buzzing. Julia spotted the damage when she came by with coffee. Carl stomped over, fists clenched, ready to march to Douglas's house himself. I stopped him. No. Let her keep digging. She's doing all the work for me. And dig she did. She couldn't attend board meetings anymore, not officially, but that didn't stop her from lurking on the fringes. She stood outside the clubhouse windows, scowling, muttering to anyone who passed that the new board was corrupt, that the community would collapse without her. When neighbors ignored her, she escalated. Flyers appeared on doorsteps, accusing the new president of embezzling funds. Emails circulated, filled with wild claims about secret deals and criminal influences. None of it stuck. People were done with her. But she didn't realize it. The more she pushed, the more desperate she looked. Then came her final, catastrophic mistake. It happened on a bright Saturday morning. A tow truck appeared again, yes, another one. Not just any tow truck, though. This was a massive, military-style wrecker, the kind of beast you'd use to haul a tank. It roared into the cul-de-sac, belching smoke, shaking windows as it stopped in front of my driveway. Neighbors rushed out, phones raised, documenting instantly. Julia gasped beside me. She didn't. But she had. Mrs. Douglas appeared from her garage, striding behind the monster truck like a conquering general returning from war. Clipboard in hand, sunglasses on, she pointed dramatically at my Jeep. "Remove it," she shouted. The operator, a burly guy in greasy coveralls, hesitated. "Lady, this thing looks fine." "You sure?" "Do as I say," she barked. The hook dropped, chains rattled, the crowd whispered. I stepped forward, calm as ever, phone recording. "Sir, this is private property. You touch that Jeep, you're liable for trespassing and damages." The man froze mid-motion. He looked from me to Mrs. Douglas, then to the 30 neighbors surrounding him, all filming. He swallowed hard. "I don't like this," he muttered. "Do it," Mrs. Douglas shrieked, stamping her heel. "That vehicle is illegal." But fate, once again, had its own sense of humor. The operator tried to maneuver the hook closer, but the chain swung wide, clanged against metal, and latched onto the nearest bumper. Not mine. Hers. The hook clamped down on the pristine grille of her BMW with an almost satisfying crunch. The driver, startled, gunned the lever too quickly. The wrecker lurched forward, dragging her beloved car a full 6 feet before he realized what had happened. The sound was unholy, metal shrieking, plastic snapping, the collective gasp of the neighborhood rising in a chorus. Mrs. Douglas screamed. "No. Stop. That's my car." Too late. The damage was done. Her BMW's bumper dangled like a broken jaw, deep scratches carved across the hood where the hook had torn free. For a moment, silence fell. Even the wrecker operator looked stunned. Then Julia, unable to contain herself, burst into laughter. Carl clapped his hands once, booming, "Poetic justice." Phones captured every second. Dozens of angles. A full cinematic experience. Mrs. Douglas collapsed to her knees beside the car, clutching the dangling bumper like a fallen comrade. "You idiots!" she shrieked, tears of fury streaking her face. "You've ruined everything." I stepped forward, voice calm, even sympathetic. "Funny how that hook keeps finding your BMW instead of my Jeep. Maybe the universe is trying to tell you something." The crowd erupted again, laughter mixing with applause. Some neighbors actually cheered. The operator, muttering curses, scrambled to detach the hook, then climbed into his cab and sped off, clearly wanting no part in the chaos. He left Mrs. Douglas sobbing beside her wounded car, surrounded by a circle of neighbors with phones pointed like spotlights. That was the moment she broke. She stood, face twisted with rage, and screamed at all of us. "You'll regret this. Every last one of you. This neighborhood will rot without me." She spun in circles, pointing at random people, shouting accusations no one could even understand. Her words tumbled over each other, gibberish about conspiracies, secret plots, even aliens at one point. Finally, she stormed back into her house, slamming the door so hard a decorative wreath fell onto the porch. The neighborhood stood in stunned silence. Then Julia spoke, voice low but firm. She's finished. And she was. By evening, the footage had gone viral, first in the neighborhood group chat, then on Facebook, then spreading outward like wildfire. Within 24 hours, someone had uploaded a montage to YouTube titled HOA Karen vs. the Tow Truck BMW Edition. Millions of views, thousands of comments, memes, remixes. The HOA board released a formal statement distancing themselves from her actions. The sheriff's office announced an investigation into her repeated false calls. Even her closest loyalists abandoned her, muttering about needing new leadership. And me? I just parked my Jeep in the driveway, polished the hood, and watched the sun set over a neighborhood finally free. A week later, as I grilled burgers on the patio, Julia raised a toast with her wine glass. To the Jeep, she said. The most powerful vehicle in the county. Carl raised his beer. And to karma. May it always find the right bumper. We laughed, the kind of deep, easy laughter that comes when the storm has finally passed. Mrs. Douglas's house sat dark across the street. Rumors swirled she was putting it up for sale, fleeing to some other unfortunate neighborhood. Maybe she'd try her antics there. Maybe she'd learn nothing. But here, in Maplewood Estates, her reign was over. As for me, I leaned back in my chair, watching the flames dance on the grill, and thought about everything that had happened. She'd tried to tow my Jeep twice. She'd plastered it with fake violations, dragged the sheriff into her crusade, spread lies, filed lawsuits, and staged a one-woman war. And yet, in the end, she'd only managed to destroy the one thing she loved most, her own shiny BMW. It wasn't just justice. It was poetry. And as I listened to the quiet hum of a neighborhood finally at peace, I couldn't help but smile. Because the best revenge hadn't been anything I'd done. The best revenge was letting her destroy herself.